Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Authors on Mission podcast, where you explore insights from experts who are transforming their fields. I'm your host, Danielle Hutchinson, Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission, and today we're joined by Dr. Elizabeth Keating, a distinguished linguistic anthropologist and author of The Essential Questions. Her groundbreaking work helps families preserve their histories through meaningful conversations across generations. Dr. Keating brings decades of experience studying communication across cultures, from many different areas, and today she's going to share how we can all become better at uncovering and preserving our family stories. So without further ado, welcome to our show, Dr. Keating.
Thank you. It's really wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, like I was saying before we started recording, you have some amazing insights to share, and this is a topic that we don't discuss too much on the show, diving into your ancestry and all of that, but when it comes to writing a book, a lot of the times, especially with nonfiction, you're talking about yourself. It all has to go into your own legacy. So, all of this kind of stuff goes and has a big part to play in the writing process, just in general. So we're going to have an amazing conversation here.
Yes, that's right. We're all, whenever we're writing, we're infusing the writing with ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the more you can dive into your own, family history and all of that, it only gives you a better sense of self, I'm sure, as you've discovered in your studies, so it just has a huge role to play. So before we dive into those specific aspects, I guess, it would be really beneficial for us to kind of back up a little bit, learn a little about you and your accomplishments and, all of that. So if you don't mind giving us a quick rundown, show our listeners today, who is Elizabeth? How did she come into this field? And what sparked you to write your book?
My book actually came out of a loss that I experienced, which was when my mother died. And when my mother died, I realized, in going through her things and thinking about her, as you do in those situations, I realized I knew hardly anything about her in terms of herself. I knew her as a mother, and I usually put her in that role, for better or for worse. But I never knew very much about her as a person. And particularly, I didn't know much about what she was like as a child and what she was like as a teenager. And the ironic thing is that I had interviewed her several years before she died, but I asked all the wrong questions. I asked her about the family tree because I thought she probably knew parts of it that I didn't. But after she died, I realized I just wanted to know about her. And I wondered what would have been the right questions to ask her. So I used my anthropology training. Why did I do that? Well, what an anthropologist does is goes to a particular location or a particular group, and we strive to find out something about that group from their own point of view, something about their different ways of doing things and their ways of being.
That's a whole other ballpark when it comes to asking somebody about their lives, right? Knowing the right questions to ask. And, I'm sure that goes a huge part to play into just, writing your books too and all of that. I'm sure that as you did research for this topic, you had to know what questions to ask, right? Where exactly you want to look in finding these. So, can you dive in a little bit more about, what are these essential questions? You've outlined 13 different topics to ask somebody. So which ones of those impact you the most? Which ones are the most important to focus on? Can you tell us a little bit more about the essential questions in general? I guess is where I'm getting with this.
What I did was I realized that I wanted to understand my mother, my grandmother, any other older person from their own point of view. So what anthropologists want to do is to try to step into another's shoes. Of course, each group has very different beliefs and very different ways of setting up the space around them and clothing and so forth. So how do you, as an anthropologist, understand what the people themselves think about that? What's it like to inhabit that way of life? So I decided to devise some questions that would ask people to describe their surroundings when they were a child and to describe aspects of their ways of life when they were a child. And even in the United States, culture 50, 60 years ago was very, very different. People lived in different ways. They wore different clothing. They had different beliefs. And all of this is fascinating to discover when you ask questions like an anthropologist does in order to understand how the person learned to be a particular person at a particular time. And so the first question, I start people out with a very, very basic question. For example, when were you born and is there a story around your name? And a couple of other warm-up questions like that, just so they get used to the interview situation. But the first substantial question is, what was the home you grew up in like? So what was the house like or the apartment like? And it's so astonishing when people start describing their childhood home. They start describing how many rooms it has, and they pause and they'll tell you what was going on in the room. That's where my mother did the cooking. That's where my mother did the washing. Or that was the addition that my father put on and that has this story behind it. So because the home is a repository for culture, just describing the home, something simple like in your memory going from room to room or thinking about your own bedroom, is liable to prompt lots of stories that the interviewee thought they'd forgotten all about. And it gives the interviewer, who's curious about their own family and what it was like for their older relatives when they were children, gets to get a sensory experience of what that world was like.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to immerse the interviewee back in that place and time, right? Time travel back there and they're looking around and trying to say like, okay, like this is what my old kitchen used to look like. This is what mom used to wear on her way to work. Like all those sorts of things are bound to prompt those memories and give more authentic, responses. So that completely makes sense. And to all of our listeners today, whether you're writing a book, about your family history or about, your business insights or whatever it is, whenever you're talking about your own experiences, these are the kind of things you need to think about, because by asking those questions, presenting those questions, you're able to give your readers that same sort of feel as if they're there in the moment with you. So I can see how that's so important in framing that for your interviewers when asking them about their heritage. So some perfect.
That's right. And we know as writers how critical details are and how critical it is to create for the reader the sensory experience of a scene. And these questions of just description, which is a lot of what anthropologists do, is description. You might think that ordinary life is boring. And in fact, some of the people I interviewed when I was researching what would be the right questions would say to me things like, oh, I just had an ordinary upbringing. And yet they would start talking about it, and it was anything but ordinary. And of course, ordinary life is exactly what's fascinating. And some anthropologists in former times would concentrate on ritual, the big rituals like weddings or rites of passage, even funerals. But ordinary life is really what's interesting when you start to describe it, and people's lives are much more unique than they think.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people think they just live that boring life, like you said, but we all have something valuable to learn from each other too. Like, and you don't really know that until you start asking those questions and diving into it. A whole other ballpark too, though, that I know you've, gone into is you interviewed the deaf community too. Is that correct?
Yes, I've researched as an anthropologist for 27 years. For some years, I did research in the deaf community. And I was particularly interested in how the deaf community was integrating webcams. So back in 1999, when webcams first appeared on the scene, which are now so much a big part of our life, the deaf community instantly realized that for the first time ever, they could use their native language, sign language, to communicate long distance. And yet they had to change the sign language. They had to change sign language from a three-dimensional space to a two-dimensional space. And they had to use a lot of different creative ways of communicating. And I was very fortunate to have a deaf PhD student in anthropology. And he and I worked together, and he taught me a lot about the deaf community and about what it's like to grow up and to use a visual language. And that's very helpful as a writer, too, because you can start to look around you in a different way. For example, when I was taking sign language lessons, one of the first things we learned was to expand our peripheral vision, because if you're in a deaf conversation or a sign language conversation, there are going to be people who are in your periphery who are trying to communicate with you. So it can really expand your ideas as a writer in terms of what's significant.
Yeah. I mean, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and really figuring out like alternate ways of communication, especially when it comes to, the deaf community, that's a completely different ballpark. Did you face any challenges when you were going through all this research in terms of like communicating in that way? I mean, I'm assuming you're pretty fluent when it comes to sign language and all that.
Well, I think I used to be, but just like every language, if you don't use it, you lose it, as they say. And my deaf PhD student went on to become a professor. And so we didn't communicate as much as we did before. So I'm afraid my skills are a bit rusty by now. But in doing the research for the Essential Questions book, I talked to people from many different countries. And I also had my students use the 13 questions in my classes at UT Austin. And I was very, very lucky that my students allowed me to use some of their findings in the book. So there are some quotes from my wonderful students at University of Texas, Austin, about what they found when they interviewed their grandparents and how delighted both my students and their grandparents were to have the interview. In fact, one of my students said after the interview, his grandfather said, "I wish you would have more of these interviews," because it gave them a chance to connect on a much deeper level than they usually had before. I mean, really, what's better than talking about yourself to someone who is an avid listener? So it can be a wonderful thing to interview people about their childhood. And I can imagine someone who's writing a book about a different period would benefit hugely from interviewing some people who can remember different ages and different experiences during that period. I learned a lot about history when I was interviewing people and reading the results of my students' interviews.
Yeah, well, can you share one of these things an example of that, one thing that you did learn that perhaps maybe resonated in the book or later on in life?
Yes, certainly. There's one question in the book at the end that asks for a particularly significant memory. So the questions in the book go through, as I said, aspects that an anthropologist would want to know about. So things like identity and dress and body adornment and belief and material culture. So the things that people keep around them. And there are social interactions and other aspects. But at the very end, I ask people if there is a particular memory that stands out. And I remember one older person in her 90s telling me a very moving story about the beginning of World War II as it impacted Britain. She said that she remembers it was a moonlit night and her parents bundled her and her brother into the car. And a moment's notice, they just had the clothes that they had on. They left all their toys, all their books, the home that they knew, and they drove across the country to a safer location because they happened to be living near a naval base that the parents were afraid would be attacked. And she said, I can still remember that night and how it was moonlit and how I thought to myself as a little girl, life can just change in a moment. So there were some striking memories like that people would talk about. One person talked about the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco when she was a teenager and how sad that was to lose so many friends. Of course, a lot of people had very happy memories too that they would talk about, that they would remember. But once you get people to understand that you want all the details, then they do strive to create a picture for us about what they experienced, and it's really delightful to share.
Yeah, I mean, when you get into those authentic moments, you would never be able to know what it really felt like for them, of course, but it makes you think about the situations that you wouldn't have considered otherwise. I mean, to have your whole entire life changed in just a moment, like you just described, it's completely different and something you otherwise would not have been able to put onto the words of the page yourself. So by interviewing these people, you're not only understanding them, emphasizing them, getting a sense of what it was like, but when you're putting it onto the print too, that's a whole other aspect because you're able to take that information and relay it to now that you've gotten your story out. And I'm assuming that's a lot what you did too in your book as well. You include a lot of examples too in stories as well. So did you find that to be a challenge at all by taking these stories and putting it onto paper?
Yes, of course, it was a challenge, but it was also fun to try to pick out the stories that I thought would resonate with the readers and would illustrate how really wonderful it is to hear someone's view of life as they lived it as a child or a teenager. So it was really thrilling to have all this wonderful material. I wish I could have included more. My editor at Penguin Random House was a wonderful, wonderful editor, I have to say, but she cut a lot. She said, people don't want to read long books these days. Probably some of your listeners have experienced that too. And it's always very difficult as a writer to have your words cut because, of course, it's taken you many hours to get the things down on the page. And some of the stories didn't get included. I have lots more that are really wonderful stories. And of course, the choices were hard to make. But I tried to get a representative sample from different countries and different eras, and also to be able to show some of what my students found, because the students would never have thought to interview their grandparents or their parents. They interviewed their parents if their grandparents were deceased. And that was exactly the population that I wanted to target because I hadn't interviewed my mother, and there's so many things I wish I'd asked her. And as I've talked to people, a lot of people tell me, oh, I wish I had your book before my grandparents died because there's so many things now I wish I could have asked them. These things, unfortunately, don't occur to us until it's too late.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that I think all of our listeners should take to heart today because you don't know the last moment you're going to be able to talk to somebody, right? Like, as sad as it is to think about, you should always make the most of these moments that you have with them. Why not ask these questions? Why not learn more about them while you still have the chance to, and then really hold on to that? That's very important to know. So, I mean, everybody, if we're learning one thing from Elizabeth today, it's to ask these questions. And if you don't know what to ask, I mean, that's kind of why we have this amazing book right here, The Essential Questions. Start reading it and know how to make the most of your time with these people. Maybe it's a piece of homework you can leave them with today, right, Elizabeth? Call your mom, see what she's up to, and just ask her some of these questions.
That's a wonderful idea. And I think in each chapter, around each question, I have something about the anthropological concept behind that question. So when I talk about identity, you want to ask if their identity has changed over time. Then I talk a little bit about what identity means and how often identity is really not a choice, even though sometimes we think of it as something that we choose for ourselves. It really has a lot to do with the people that we're surrounded by. And a good example of that is one of the students brought back a short vignette from his grandparent when he asked about identity. And his grandmother said, that she and her husband, his grandfather, had moved to California after they were first married. They had moved to California. And she said the identity she had in California was of someone who had no value because she was just a housewife. And she couldn't wait to get back to Texas, where she was a farm wife and she was highly valued as an equal member of the team in helping to run the farm. And I thought that was a very interesting story, too, of how identity can be shaped by a particular location.
Yeah, and I see you keep circling back to that too, like the setting, the location, the home that they're in. It really does shape you because you're living in it. It is affecting every aspect of you. So that's really something to think about. I like that. Something to think about today. To all of our listeners, where are you right now? What's your location as you're listening to this, right? Are you in your car? Are you in your home? That probably affects your perception of what you're hearing right now too. So all important things to think about. Elizabeth, I'm wondering, you mentioned before, a lot of these stories do not make it into your book. Like maybe some of the ones you even showed with me today weren't in your book. It's a shame that your editors didn't allow you to include all of that. I mean, it must have been a really hard process to figure out, okay, what do I have to put aside for now? What can actually make it in? It's a shame because, here at Authors on Mission, I'm an editor too. I do ghostwriting, editing, all that. And whenever I work with somebody, I always try to, think of it from their point of view too. I mean, you're spending all this time interviewing, writing it out, talking to these people. I don't want my clients to feel like they were expecting so that must have been really hard for you. What was that like, that experience? And do you have any tips for our listeners today who maybe are going through the same process?
Yes, certainly it's difficult. On the other hand, it's a collaboration, isn't it? We write, but we depend on the publishers to be able to utilize their expertise in terms of what is marketable and what they feel their own teams are going to be best supported by. And as an academic, I was very used to having editors and reviewers cut things from my academic articles. So the process of getting an academic article published is quite rigorous. And you have to go through a peer review process in which the peer reviewers have all kinds of ideas about how your article can be improved. And it's really up to us as academics to pay attention to what the peer reviewers have to say. And so I've always thought of it as a process of rewriting according to the experts down the line, whether it's the peer reviewers or the publishers, taking their expertise into account as well. I really do think there is something to the idea of a shorter book because people have so many demands on their time now. And my book wasn't a novel. I love a long novel because once I get into the setting and the characters, I don't really want the story to end. But this was a nonfiction book, and it's designed to get people started doing something. So I think the idea of keeping it a bit simpler was probably a good one. And of course, I really do have a lot of experience before this with nonfiction of the scholarly type, which does require an awful lot of collaboration between the author and the reviewers.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I mean, whenever I work with my clients, we try to make it very hands-on, back and forth. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? It's important to have your own voice when you're working with your manuscript. I guess I'm just wondering, I mean, I hope that all those stories aren't lost. I hope you still have them saved somewhere. And, maybe one day if you want to, you could even make another book and take those stories and mesh it into like a part 2, or even just like, a compilation of stories, whether or not it has to do with the essential questions, just like these people's, lives and interviews, that you do have them somewhere, right?
I
So,
love your enthusiasm
okay.
about the value of a story and a personal story, Danielle. I think that's so wonderful because they are precious. They really are precious stories. Fortunately, all of the students have their stories and they have kept them.
Yeah.
And the stories that I have that didn't get into the book, I have used some of them in magazine articles because, of course, we all have to do a lot to promote our books. And
Mm.
so I have been able to use some of them in that way or in podcasts and so forth. So yes, I share your sentiment though, because every person you talk to has such a wonderful story if you know the right questions to ask.
Yeah, and I love that you brought that up too, because I was going to say there's 2 different directions you could go with it. Is like one, either making a sequel book, or perhaps like a side book, like one like, for more information, go to this book, right? But adding it into promotional content is a whole other thing that, a lot of authors might not think to do. If you have a lot of content, you can't fit it into your book, use it to promote, use it to
Yeah.
continue establishing the book before and after the manuscript comes out. You can lay out a content calendar and continuously distribute that. I mean, I'm glad that you did that, and that's probably why, one of many reasons why your book became so successful is you have so much more content to get out there and draw more readers in. So.
Yes, one thing I did find is that the audience for the book is often not university students, although there are some professors in different universities who are using the book because it's so successful. And one of them even told me he got the best student reviews the semester he used the book because the students enjoyed so much the project. But I think that when you're trying to promote the book, you have to be aware of who your target audience is. And unfortunately, I would love to target people in their 20s and 30s, but very often they don't think there's any mortality in their family and they don't really think about these sort of legacy issues. And so, because the people that are interested in reading the book are typically older, that's more of a print audience than, say, a TikTok audience, for example. And so this is where the other stories can come in handy as writing articles because they are more likely to be reading that genre rather than watching the social media, at least the way things are now.
I do agree with you there. I guess if I was scrolling through TikTok and I started getting a reel about, oh, ask your mom these questions, I probably be like, but it's a shame. I wonder if like one day we would be able to kind of promote that kind of thinking and maybe in a different context, right? But it's important stuff that, our I admit it, I don't ask it myself, but there would be a nice way to kind of bring the culture back towards this sort of thing if we could get that out there more. Just as a ballpark, I wonder if like maybe another book to be written could be like how to get your children to ask you questions, almost reversing
Yes.
the questions, but like how to get your child to be more curious about your stories and life. I wonder if that's a whole nother, project out there too.
Yes, that's a very good idea, to really try to address this issue because the students, I only have a limited number of students I can make this compulsory for. Although I did have students tell me this was their favorite project in all universities. So it's very appealing once they start to do it. And one of the most appealing parts to it is the bridge that these questions can create across the generations. Because there's so much loneliness now. I don't know if you've been reading all the articles and all the posts about loneliness. It's becoming very, very prominent in people's minds. And this is one project that can overcome loneliness, not only on the part of the older population who can suddenly feel that they have something to contribute, but also for younger people who are also apparently very lonely.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a whole other side of it, right? So by asking these questions and diving into it, you heal that loneliness in a way, to not only having a time to talk to somebody else, but understanding that other people have gone through the same types of experiences, just like you've been saying. I understand that completely.
Yes.
Well, as we continue with this conversation, Elizabeth, I'm just curious, you have your book, you have your classes. I'm wondering what's next on the horizon for you? I mean, we've talked a little bit about how you have some untold stories, but, first off, any other projects brewing right now?
Well, I have a couple of ideas, but none of them have really come to fruition yet.
Okay. Ask that in terms of there's anything for us to be on the lookout for in the future, but who knows, maybe, in the future, some of these, stories can come out in traditional blog and more articles, or, maybe we could think about those other books, but just, ballparking out there. But branching off of that then, everybody here listening to today has clearly been inspired by what you have to say about the questions and about legacies. So if they want to find out more information, I mean, how could they learn more from you? How can they find out more about your projects and what you do and in your books? Where can they reach out to you about?
They can try my website, which is elizabeth-keating.com. And I usually have my ongoing projects there, and also different podcasts like this one. And yes, I think probably the best place is the website.
Perfect. Okay, so we're going to have the link to your website right here in the description for everyone to check out and click on and, learn more about you. And you can obviously find a copy of the Essential Questions anywhere, where you can buy a book and learn more about it and take these powerful messages and experiences and apply them to your own life. I'm wondering, Elizabeth, do you have any last pieces of advice that you might want to share with our audience here today regarding either the writing process or about talking to your family members in the interview stages?
About the interviewing family members, I would say there's more urgency than you think, and you should do it right away, and it's a lot of fun. And about writing, I would say just do some writing every day, and you'll get better and better at writing, and it becomes part of your day in a very enjoyable way. Fortunately, I like the editing process. I think it's the first draft process for me that's the most difficult. But I think the key is to have writing as part of your day all the time, even a short, very short bit of time. It's so important to keep writing.
Oh, definitely. Like, no matter what your schedule's like, I always tell my listeners, my clients, and, everybody I speak with, you got to find a time to put some words down on a page, whether it's on the notes app on your phone as you're going to work, or, sitting down on the computer for 20 minutes, whatever it is, keep the inspiration going. So I appreciate that piece of advice. That's something we could all take home with us today. So I think all 2 of our listeners, we have 2 pieces of homework then. We have to go and we have to talk to our family members, ask one of these questions to them, apply Dr. Keating's advice today, as soon as this podcast ends. And also, open up a document. If you have some ideas for writing, just get started. The only way to make sure that your book's going to be completed is by actually doing it, actually starting to write. So I appreciate that. Well, without further ado then, again, everybody, check out the Essential Questions at your local bookstore or Amazon, wherever you can get a hold of it. It's important to know. And, well, without further ado, this brings us to the end of our podcast today. We've been speaking with Dr. Keating about her book, The Importance of Preserving Family Histories, thoughtful interviews. Her approach offers valuable tools for connecting across generations and understanding our family roots. And I can't thank you enough for coming on our podcast today, because you've really shown us how to ask these questions, how to bridge these gaps, and to strengthen family bonds. And as we know in today's day and age, it couldn't be more important. So again, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Keating.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Always. And to all of our listeners, keep asking those questions, keep writing, keep inspiring, and we'll see you on the next episode of Authors on Mission podcast. Have a great day. This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.